Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, starting your practicing period as a pupil barrister. My name's Lecky Thandy. I'll be chairing the session today. Just by way of small background, if I can put it that way, I'm a criminal barrister at One High Pavement Chambers in Nottingham, called to the bar quite some time ago now in 2011. I'm also currently the circuit junior on the Midlands circuit. The format of the evening is likely to be a panel discussion with George Bennett, Kate Traynor, Rumen Cholikov, followed by a short 5 to 10 minutes with Rachel Chris, who'll be talking to you about what to do if you witness or experience bullying in chambers, and also hopefully being able to signpost you to resources that are available at the bar. We'll also be joined by Jonathan Lawrence later on in the session from Place Campbell, who will deliver a short presentation for you on how to manage your finances, which is really quite important from the outset, really, when you're starting out as a self-employed barrister. Right at the very end of the session, we hope to have some time for some questions and answers for you. There is a function which I hope you've all got and can see, where you can post your questions. Just at the bottom of your link, you should see Q&A. Please feel free to post any questions that you have on there. Just a gentle reminder as well that the session is being recorded, will be made available to watch on the Bar Council website following the session as well. And for those of you who would like the live transcription, that's also available, again, available at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first person I would like to introduce to start with the panel discussion is George Bennett, who's a senior practice manager at Outer Temple Chambers. He'll start with introducing himself, I'm sure, but also to help you so you can understand what you can expect from your clerking team at your respective chambers and how they can support you through pupillage and beyond. To begin with, George, could you assist with guidance on how to become self-employed in terms of VAT registration and all of those really important things that you have to obviously do when you first start on your feet?
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone. Just quick intro. I began clerking in 2008, and then through my progression, I've been fortunate enough to have exposure to vast majority of the areas of law and clerked most of them. It's always quite tricky and quite daunting, as we understand you guys have done a lot of studying and then you're now been put through a year-long interview. So every day is quite high pressured. So there's a lot of things that we expect that you might not understand, or you might need guidance, and Chambers hopefully has those facilities to assist you. Obviously, we've got someone from Place Campbell speaking a bit later. So having a good accountant on board is certainly highly recommended. VAT is a bit of a tricky one because until you hit the threshold, you don't actually need to be VAT registered, although most chambers will try to encourage you to do this as early as possible. I believe the threshold is 80,000. And the main reason for chambers pushing for you to do this as soon as possible is for that period where we're billing things where you're not VAT registered. So we're not charging VAT. And then you then become VAT registered from that exact date. And then if we're still chasing older fees, which don't have VAT, we then need to go back to the clients and ask for VAT. So we try to get it done as soon as possible. Other things to be aware of are time management. We don't want you to get burnt out, but we also don't want you to be saying no to good opportunities. And billing, getting on top of your billing. The best habit I can is to do it at the end of every day. Spend 5-10 minutes. I think you'll be blown away by the amount of people that leave it for a month, 2 months, and then can't remember what they actually did. So you're just losing out on money. My biggest recommendation for you is remember day one of your pupillage, you are part of the Chambers team. You don't have to wait to become a tenant or second sixth, third sixth. From day one to clerks and the wider team, the fees team, the marketing, you are part of the Chambers family, and we are there to support and assist you with anything you may need. Anything that you might not feel comfortable speaking to your pupil supervisor, please come to us. Majority of chambers now have dedicated fees team who will talk you through different fee agreements such as legal aid, CFA, DBAs. They'll also talk you through the likelihood of when you will get paid on certain cases. You also have the marketing teams who will help you with online profiles, directories, obviously a bit later down in the line, but it's always good to get in the habit of seeing what people are putting forward, and it's normally quite a good sharing policy within most chambers, so you can see how to get started. But yeah, I think my biggest recommendation is don't suffer on your own. We appreciate it can be sometimes, especially nowadays, can be quite lonely if your pupil master is in a 2-week trial, but you've been set some other task, so you're just in their room. Most chambers will have an open door policy, so just embed yourself in chambers environment. And it's always worth noting that clerks are often asked for feedback, so it is an easy win if you just come in and tell us what you've been up to at the weekend, and you just break up the monotony of the day. People will warm to you, and it's just an easy win, I think.
Just dealing with clerks and relationships and building those, because of course when you even when you start off in your first 6, you're going into a set of chambers. Some are obviously bigger than others, and you might start off feeling like a small fish in a rather big pond, and other than knowing perhaps your pupil supervisor, it can be quite difficult to get to know other members of chambers, but particularly clerks, because a lot of the work now is done digitally, and some people may find that they go into chambers less frequently. Obviously, there's junior clerks and senior clerks. How would one go with building relationships from top to bottom of rank, I suppose?
I think with the junior clerks, it will certainly happen probably quite naturally, I would have thought. You'll probably need help with basic office tasks. You may need a leader in a case may ask you to arrange the papers being taken to the court, and then I think that relationship will probably be very organic, because there'll be little tasks that they'll be helping you with. They're always running around chambers. You're probably going to bump into them. And as far as I'm aware, all clerks are friendly, so it should be quite organic. I would have thought. As they start to go up, I think the more senior clerks you will meet probably on the second sixth as a formal meeting. Not to say that we wouldn't speak to you and know you through your third sixth, but a formal meeting, especially if you're at a chambers where you're sent out to work on your second sixth, you will certainly have a formal sit-down meeting just to explain just the basic tasks of how work comes through the door, how it be allocated, if you've got any problems, if something comes up, if you're going to be late for court, for example, or we need to build that relationship there, because we know you're probably likely to be nervous, and we need you to know that if you're not comfortable, you can come to us and tell us. We don't expect you to know your craft after 6 months, so the relationship will probably begin there, and then especially if you're being sent out to work, we'll probably speak to you most days. Someone from the clerking team will speak to you most days. From there, if you look at chief execs and bits and pieces, the ball probably is more in your park, because they're doing an overarching view of chambers as a whole and as a business. And they will sit down with you at some point. But if you wanted to sit down with them beforehand and try to understand chambers goals, or where you fit into those goals and what you can do, and because most of these people have been in chambers or in business for a long time, there's a lot of knowledge they will have, whether it's in chambers or external, that you can probably benefit from, especially going into self-employed practice.
And in terms of the roles that clerking teams have, I imagine from one practice area to another, largely similar. But in terms of roles, it's not just a case of your clerks clerking you into a brief. That's it. That's what you're doing, and off you go. What if someone ends up with something? It's out of hours, and by the time they've read the papers, they come to think that actually it's beyond their level of expertise, or they don't feel comfortable doing it. How does the clerking team fit into that scenario?
I think it's certainly easier post-COVID. Our mobile numbers are easily accessible, I think, to anyone who goes on the website now, especially at my chambers. Or you will be given a mobile number, or you will, because what so much chat now is done on WhatsApp or text rather than email. People trying to reduce their inbox to more important work tasks, I tend to find, and then general queries are via your phone. You should never be afraid to call us out of hours. Even if you did feel uncomfortable, I would imagine nearly all chambers have an out of hours number anyway, which will then go to a clerk. But I would suggest calling this more senior clerk you have access to in your phone book, calling them up, and the magic behind the scenes will take place, and we'll make sure that any stresses you have are erased, or we'll reallocate the brief.
Yeah, I think that's quite helpful, particularly because I imagine it's been some time since I was a pupil, but when you are getting onto your feet and you end up with a brief that you think, oh God, I don't think I can deal with this, there's the fear of not being able to deal with the actual brief, but then the fear of having to ring a clerk to say, really sorry, I can't deal with this, and the fear of being judged at that particular point. I assume the cards aren't marked for raising an issue in that way, are they?
No, if anything, we'd rather know.
Yeah.
As early as you know. Is that my biggest advice is just do not stress. Speak to someone, because something you may be stressing about may not be correct, or run it past your pupil supervisor. They will always, the way that it works in my chambers, the pupil supervisors have to sign off on them doing a piece of work anyway, because they're covered under their insurance. So I'd like to think it would be headed off then. But if you don't feel comfortable telling your supervisor, do tell the clerks. We are there to assist you, to aid you, to help you grow. And even if it's just something silly, you're travel anxious, that's stuff we need to know. And then we can try and build a practice central London or Nottingham or wherever you're based. And so that you don't have to do long journeys, or if there's any anxieties or fears you have over anything, well-being is so well spoken about in chambers, but I still don't think it's enough. People still do get scared, especially on their pupillage. As I said earlier, it is like a year-long interview, which is a very rare thing for anyone to go through, and I couldn't imagine the stress that it can put on you. So just don't be afraid.
Yeah, it does actually feel like it's a year-long exam in reality, doesn't it? Because you feel like you're being watched from every angle,
Yeah.
where you speak, who you speak to, whether you're doing the work that's asked of you. But it's really important, I would say from personal experience as well, to raise it with the clerks, because the whole point of having clerking teams is for the support, really, and to help build a practice. Not only does it reflect on you individually, but it reflects on chambers as a whole as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Going back to one of your earlier questions, I think the easiest way to start building a relationship is just pop your head in and say hello. And then organically, I think chat will begin then. No one's going to ask you questions about work, unlikely, especially if you're coming in at 8:30, 9:00 in the morning.
Yeah.
People are probably just going to want to see how you are. So don't look at us as a big, scary force of nature. Just come in. I appreciate, especially in the bigger chambers, it's daunting coming into a room, and like my chambers, we have one long desk with about 15 of us around it. I can imagine it'd be quite daunting, you walking in and everyone looking up if you said hello. But even go and stand next to, just pick someone and just say hello, how are you? Do you want to grab a coffee? Anything like that. Nowadays, people would love to just step out. You just don't get enough time away from your desk, so people will be very grateful.
Yeah, it's very true. Is there a single best piece of advice that you can give to wrap up your section?
Just you're not alone. Don't ever think you are alone. Chambers can be a daunting place. You are self-employed. But just remember, we're not self-employed. We are there to provide you a service and assist you, and we wouldn't want you suffering. We want you to be able to put the best product out, and just grow Chambers, and yeah, just never suffer alone.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, George. We're going to move the discussion on a little bit to Kate Trainer, who's a barrister at Landmark Chambers. Kate, I think you're going to introduce your personal experience of pupillage and how you've navigated it and your career following on from there.
Yeah, so by way of just a brief background, I didn't do pupillage at Landmark Chambers. I received my offer of pupillage in 2019 whilst I was on the BPTC, and started my pupillage at Exchange Chambers in Manchester in their commercial and sort of business team. I started pupillage in January 2020, so just before the pandemic. So I was very much a COVID pupil and spent a lot of time remote and not in chambers. I actually thought about it earlier, and I spent 6 months working from home without already engaging with anyone in pupillage. I received an offer for tenancy at Exchange Chambers, became a tenant, and then in December 2021, so quite early on in my practice, I then moved to Landmark Chambers. So that's just how I've ended up where I've ended up. In terms of my pupillage, my first 6 months was obviously non-practising. I had one supervisor, but I was generally allocated out with different people. And my first 6 months was split, where I would sit with quite senior people for 3 months, and I would get an insight into what they were doing. So more heavily drafting, advice, conferences, mediations. And then my second 3 months I spent with the people that were similar level to core to me, seeing what they were doing, so that when it came to my second 6, I knew what I was walking into and didn't sort of stand there going, oh God, how do I do this? My pupillage was largely remote, and that did, I think, impact how I built my relationships with my clerks and other members of chambers. That now that we do have sort of more WhatsApp groups, texting, I'm very acute to that, and that's what I'm used to, as opposed to being in chambers with this big open door policy, because it just wasn't what I had during my pupillage. In terms of my second 6, I was practising. I was in court on my very first day. I was against somebody who was 7 years my senior in a bankruptcy petition. And I'm very candid about it. I was very nervous to the point that my hands were shaking because it was all remote. No one could see it. And I thought, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing. This person's really senior to me. How am I going to go about it? And it was probably one of the better hearings I had in my second 6 pupillage, because opposing counsel was really helpful. The judge was really helpful. And I walked away thinking, actually, I can kind of do this job. It's not the end of the world. And I wasn't shaking after that. What I found really helpful from that process was trial and error of figuring out what actually helped me in court and what I needed to prep. And one of the things that I found really helpful was creating my sales checklists. So I would do a lot of winding up petitions and possession hearings and bankruptcy petitions, that you can have a sort of checkbox of going through and saying, okay, do I have these documents? Do I have these papers? What do I need for this? And I found that really helpful, as to being able to say, okay, well, I don't have these documents. I need to go and ask for those documents. And then that built the foundations for things like my skeleton arguments or my speaking notes. So that was something I did invest quite a bit of time in during my pupillage, and it was recommended by other members that if you are doing things that are a bit repetitive, that you can build those checklists, and that helps minimize the feeling of going, okay, am I going to miss something? Am I going to make a mistake? And I ran all my checklists past senior members of chambers, and then I just passed them on to people that came after me, and they now were a thing at that set.
Yeah, so like a precedent, your own documents that you've effectively made, which others are using now.
Exactly, and it was just a simple checklist of a table with tick boxes. But then I did then go on to develop my own precedent list of, you get things quite repeat when you're a junior. You probably draft the same sort of pleadings a couple of times, and you can just build a precedent folder from that. And once you've had feedback on one, you can develop that into your next piece of work. And I think that was a really helpful thing that I did during my pupillage, was labelling documents like particulars of claim, possession proceedings. And then I'd get new instructions of drafting particulars of claim for possession, and I'd put it up and be like, okay, that's the feedback I had that time, that's what I sent out. And you can build it up, that again, you start to minimize that feeling of going, am I going to make a mistake? Am I going to get it wrong? Because you know somebody's looked at it before, signed it off, and that you can use that to build from it. And I still do that now into tenancy. Things that I drafted way back during my pupillage, if I get it new now, I bring it up and I go, okay, yeah, that's how I did that, and I reuse it. But asking other juniors for precedents as well, that was something that I didn't do as much in my second six that I probably should have, but definitely do now as part of my early practice. And with the other sort of juniors at my chambers, we do share precedents, and there will just be a message in a group chat saying, has anyone ever done this before? And somebody replies saying, yes, here you go. And you get various precedents, which really does help minimize that feeling of going, am I going to make a mistake? Am I going to get something wrong? Or have I missed something?
Did you have that fear whilst you were a pupil, the fear of asking a question in case it was too silly a question, for example?
Yeah, I was really nervous during my pupillage about asking stupid questions, and it was one of the key pieces of feedback that in my first 6 months I was really timid in chambers. And now I'm just, I preface things as saying, I'm going to ask you a stupid question. I did it yesterday to another junior. I was like, I'm going to ask you a stupid question. And he went, that's fine, go on. I asked him, and he went, I asked somebody else that 2 days ago. So I've definitely learned that there are, whilst you may think it's a stupid question, everybody's asking those questions, and that's how you learn. And I'd rather, and I say it to our pupils now, ask the question and feel maybe stupid for 30 seconds asking it, but you get the answer, as opposed to going into it going, I didn't ask the question and I'm not 100% sure whether I've done this right or not.
Yeah. And did your pupil supervisor ever just check in with you to make sure that you were understanding everything? Did they ever feel as though you weren't asking enough questions, or just generally checking in that you were keeping on top of things?
So my pupil supervisor, I had two different ones. My first six pupil supervisor, she would sit down with me after every piece of work, and she would do like a tick box, and she'd like, you got this right. And she would score things out of how many issues there were. So if there's 10 issues, you'd get 10 marks, and she'd go through it and give you your feedback. And if you made a mistake, she'd say, why didn't you ask me about this? And you just ask in future. If you're uncertain, ask the question. I'd rather you get it right and learn from it than make a mistake. But she was very much of the view, pupillage was your time to make mistakes. My second supervisor was very different. He rang me every morning and every afternoon to check that I was still alive, had made it to court, and I hadn't done anything too stressful that particular day. And he did a check-in all the time with me to make sure I was getting through, because your second six, I do think, is a lot tougher and harder than your first six, particularly if you are going out to court and you're traveling a lot and you're trying to juggle your papers with court hearings that you've never done before. And you can be in front of judges who are a little bit difficult, who at the end of your day you walk out going, well, that was really tough. And speaking to your supervisor really relieves that, and you do realise you're not alone. Judges are difficult with everybody.
And in terms of your second six, I imagine obviously different practice areas, people find themselves on their feet a different number of days, I suppose, in any given week. So if you're in a criminal pupillage, for example, I expect that you're probably in court virtually every single day, whether that's at the magistrate's court doing various lists, or whether you're sent up to the Crown Court for something. How often did you find yourself in court?
I didn't in pupillage, and I don't now have a heavy court-based practice. To get me into the role of going to court regularly, I was sent all the time to the winding up list, the bankruptcy list, and the possession list. So you get in maybe 3 times, but that would be for maybe an hour that you're there. They did build it up, but I don't imagine I was in court more than 2 to 3 times a week. And I checked it the other day, and I'm in court one or 2 times a week now. I don't have a big court practice, which was very different to other pupils who and my friends who are in court every day, and I'm just sat at home on my papers.
And in terms of preparing for hearings, how long were you typically finding that you were spending during your second six?
I was definitely overspending time and I didn't plan for it. And I think that's very easy to do because you can be quite nervous and you want to get everything right. I started to set a rule of thumb as to if it's an hour long hearing, I'm going to spend sort of 3 hours going through my prep and making sure if I don't have to have a skeleton argument, if I've then got a skeleton argument, it's going to take me about 6 hours. So I'd be like, okay, this might take me 9 hours if I've got to do a skeleton argument. For one day hearings, I was like, okay, I need at least a day and a half prep. And you start to realize as you go through it what you do and don't need. And now, if I've got a one day hearing, I'll check the papers. I'm like, actually, this could take me 2 days to get through because it's a lot of work. But it was definitely overspending when I first started, which would then have an impact on other things because you're still trying to figure out where your balance is. And you might have multiple sets of papers and then somebody else like, oh, this hearing will take you a couple of hours to prep, and it's not a couple of hours because you've never done it before, so you overspend. But I think that's just a very natural thing that as you progress you will learn what something will take and how long it will take. And even now I don't always get it right. My clerks are like, no, this is going to take you this length of time, and you've underquoted yourself.
Yeah. And is it okay to say no to work during your pupillage? Did you find that you were able to say no if you felt that you had far too much to deal with?
I think during my pupillage and early years attendance, I've established really good relationships with my clerks, and I think I have a tendency to be a bit of a people pleaser. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Realistically, I can't do every piece of work, and you end up in a position that if you say yes to everything, you're either not producing the best quality work, you're running over on deadlines, or you're just burnt out. So with my clerks during pupillage and with early years of tenancy, they now check and we do a weekly check and I say, okay, I've got 40 hours worth of work. And they then say, no, you're not taking anything else on. And I established that very quickly because I was like, look, I will just say yes to everything. And that's not a good thing to do because obviously you want to impress people, but you also want to produce really good work. And saying yes to everything will mean that you're not going to produce that good quality work. So you can say no. It's just about how you approach that. You can't just send an abrupt email to your clerk saying, no, I'm not doing this. You have to have a sensible conversation and build that up with them and explain why. And I've never had a clerk push back on me and say, no, you're doing it. They've always been really respectful of saying, actually, yeah, Kate, no, that's fine. Completely understand. We'll find somebody else.
Yeah, and it goes back to what George was saying earlier, that building relationships with clerks is really important, but it is actually relatively easy as well, even if it is just popping into chambers to say hello, have a coffee. And then the more you get to know your clerks, the more comfortable you'll feel being able to say to them, look, I feel swamped at the moment. And it's key, particularly at the moment, because well-being at the bar is something that is lacking in reality. And so when you're starting out as a pupil, it's really quite important to be able to have frank conversations with your clerks. And also your pupil supervisor as well, I imagine, because ultimately, if you're not asking for the help or a bit of breathing space, you will burn out. And what we call a work-life balance starts to disappear. Did you find that you managed to have a work-life balance or not really?
I think it took time to establish that. Certainly in my first few months of second six, I just wanted to please everybody and show I was really good and could do the things that was being asked of me. And that very quickly meant that I didn't have my weekends. And because I didn't have my weekends, I was tired when it came to the week. And you then do just feel yourself burning out a little bit. And it's just having a frank conversation with the clerks and saying, look, like I've got a lot on. I just need a little bit of breathing space. I need to have a bit of time. And I, even to this day, work very hard with my clerks to establish that because I am the type of person that would be like, yes, I will do that because that sounds really interesting. Give me it. And then other stuff will come in that you quoted for 3-4 weeks ago that you've completely forgotten about and they want you to do it. So I do think it takes a while to establish. It's not easy to establish, especially because you'll overspend. But having those conversations with your pupil supervisor, with your other sort of peers, and with your clerks are really important because they are the people that will help you. And our juniors in chambers, a couple of them, the clerks put into their diary, check before booking, keep free, they need time to do papers. and we've all established that system. So, but that came from having conversations. It didn't just happen by me putting stuff in my diary. I went to the clerks and said, I'm stressed, I have a lot on, how can we deal with this? And they went, okay, once a week we'll put a block out day and you'll have a day to catch up. And that's what I do. And when things get a bit too much, they put an extra day in, but it only comes from me communicating that with them.
Yeah, that's key. I'm going to bring Rumen in at this point. Rumen Cholikov is a barrister at 3VB. Rumen, again, if you could introduce yourself as well, I'm going to ask you to jump in on this conversation because I think, balancing the urgency and quality of work during pupillage is something that you might be able to touch upon as well.
Thanks. My background is not very dissimilar from Kate's in terms of the way I did pupillage, because mine was also in that COVID year, mostly remote. But I'm going to try to focus more on tips for the reality today, in the hope that that's the reality we're going to be facing forever, as opposed to going back to what was back in 2020. Coming back to your question, I think when people ask me what is important during pupillage, when you're doing work for your supervisors and when you're balancing work for real clients in your second six, I think the difference between the first six and the second six is that for the most part, the first six is about you learning and obviously about chambersing your abilities. So 90% of the cases, you might find that the work that you're doing is not necessarily urgent, but it is more important that you do the best quality work that you can. And very often, if you're not comfortable with the work product, it is better simply to ask for an extension, and you're very likely to be given that. And it's more important to shine than to meet the deadlines, unless you're in the 10% of cases where the deadlines for an urgent research for somebody, and that needs to go to court. In that case, it's different. I think in the second six, the situation changes a little bit, because when you're picking up work on your feet, then that has real deadlines and you've got to meet those. You might find that your second six supervisors, however, are also trying to test your ability to respond within a certain time frame more than your previous supervisors would have been. That said, if you do have competing commitments, again, my advice would be to err on the side of asking for more time, unless you know that there is a real deadline, and making sure that you put in the best possible work. You'll find that very few people will remember that you asked for an extra week to do a big pleading, if anyone. They're very much more likely to remember that your pleading wasn't up to the standard that they would expect it to be. So do take as much time as you think you need within the circumstances. And also, there's no issue with telling your supervisors that you've got a counter court hearing that you need to attend, and that is more urgent, and therefore we need more time. And it's just come about, as they always do, and they will understand that.
And from your experience, did you have any difficulties in saying to your clerks that you had too much work on at any given time? Did you feel able to say to them that, can I be kept free so I can prep for these cases? Or did you find that you just kind of just sucked it up and just got on with it and then suffered in the long term?
I think the clerks are very much responsive to your needs and your wishes. I think, as Kate said, I mean, the thing about the bar, unlike being in a law firm, is that you are self-employed. Ultimately, people come from different backgrounds and have different paths. Yes, you are in a particular year with your peers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be working in the same manner. There's going to be the same expectation that you do it in a particular way. I've never had an issue with the clerks of not being able to say no. I think I've been fortunate that they're also they're also very able to predict, in terms of when looking at my diary, how long something's going to take, and sort of putting forward for opportunities that they think that I can also meet. So I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I've had to say no. I mean, there are obviously cases that you always say no to a few things from time to time, but for me, for the majority of opportunities, I've been able to say yes and move them around. And one thing that you tend to find is that clients very often at the beginning of the instruction would seek that you read in immediately, or somebody who's available today. in your class will reach out to you and they'll say, can you read in over the weekend, for example? What almost, well, unless there's an urgent injunction, what very often happens, and even if there is, what very often happens is you say yes, and then the real court hearing is in 3 months' time, and so you'll find that it always appears a lot more urgent than it actually is, because once you get stuck in, there are a lot more questions, things get pushed back. But I think from that point of view, my tip would be try to make time at least to be able to say to the clerks, yes, I can make time to read in at least a little bit immediately, so that they can also tell the clients that you can be around to answer any urgent questions. And I think more often than not, you'll find that there isn't anything that is so urgent. And it might be that the lay client hasn't put in funds in place, and everything takes longer. So that's my advice. They're on the side of saying, yes, I can read in quickly.
Yeah, and just in relation to clients, whether they're solicitors or otherwise, how did you go about developing practices? And I think that's something that both you and Kate could perhaps touch on, about developing your practices, your relationships with solicitors and clients generally, particularly in your second six. Did you find that there were any things that were particularly useful, or anything that you would particularly avoid in that aspect of your second six?
Yes, I think something George did mention, Kate. I think your first point of call, particularly in second six, in the beginning of practice, is the clerk's room. I do appreciate that with remote hearings and the after COVID, the tools we've got, it's easier to either work from home or remotely, but and you should take advantage of that as much as possible. But in the early area of practice, I think it's really, really important to be in chambers, to be visible, to pass through the clerk's room, just say hi potentially, or mention what you're working on and what your capacity is going to be, and start that way. I think your second line of client development is then the cases that you do actually pick up. And I think in my earlier, well, I'm still in my early years, but in my first cases, I think what I found is that if you do really well on a case for a particular client, they're very likely, and that will be an introduction you get through the clerk's room in most cases, they're very likely to come back to you again and again. And it is also true, I think, that in your early years of practice, it's a lot easier to build client relationships, because ultimately, especially with junior clients, junior solicitors, because you will be growing together. You will be building experience over a number of years. And of course, the expectations are different in terms of you will not be leading $500 million cases in the High Court necessarily from day one, which a Silk will be. And so the pressures are different. And if you have built a relationship with a solicitor for 10 years or for 15 years before you take Silk, then you'll be in a very good stead afterwards for them to recommend you for those big opportunities, for them to be able to back you in front of the lay clients that you're somebody who's really good. I think the third and very important aspect of building clients are obviously the Silks in chambers. My advice is to treat all the Silks as clients, because ultimately, although you're in the same chambers and in some ways they might feel like your leaders or your bosses, I think that the better way of looking at them is they're your clients, because ultimately you're all self-employed. Everybody's an independent barrister. They've got a choice of juniors to work with. You've got a choice of Silks to be led by. Also, you might find that there are Silks with whose style you're better suited for, you more adapt to more easily, and then you build a longer term relationship. There are other Silks with whom it might not work as well. But do look at them as clients, where you want to basically treat them in the same way as you treat a solicitor, and try and be as helpful as possible.
And Kate, from your experience in your first year in practice, are there any tips that you could perhaps give in relation to how to please your clients, or what makes you memorable, I suppose, and forging those good relationships from the start?
I think that was something that also concerned me, but I thought when you're in your first 12 months, you think, oh, I haven't really made any strong connections. And then I moved chambers, and people that had instructed me in Manchester had followed to instruct me in London, and I still get instructed by them despite the fact that I'm no longer up north. And I think the relationships that I look back on where I have still got those strong relationships, they grow. I think one of my solicitors is now one of my closest friends, all sort of stemmed from being proactive and sending an email when I get the instructions in saying, receive these instructions, I'm going to read in at this time, if there's anything you want to speak about, let me know, and being available for them, and appreciating as well that sometimes they're going to ask you questions that you didn't actually full pop your brief, and answering that question and being available to answer that question, or having them text you or drop you a message and say, look, I've got a question on a different matter, can you help me with it? Those sorts of things really built foundations for me. And you kind of in the moment go, I'm answering this question for free, and or if they've asked me, and you get really annoyed by it. But some of my really good work now comes from those people that I did little favors for, of saying, yes, pick up the phone, I can spend 5 minutes chatting through that with you. Or, when I'm drafting my documents, being really proactive. And, I have a rule that, and a lot of people don't, if you're drafting an advice, some people will just draft the advice and they have loads of requests for further information. I personally think that achieves nothing. And I message the solicitors in advance and say, I've got this advice, this is all missing. Before I start it, can you get me this information? And I think it's just little things like that of being proactive with your clients and doing little things what don't seem like a lot, but are actually above and beyond, put you in good stead with them. And then making yourself available for their marketing events. If they invite you to something, it is a diary commitment, treat it as a diary commitment, go. If your chambers invite you to something, treat it as a diary commitment and go. So those things I think really stand you in good stead, because you're putting yourself out there, you're being proactive, you're having conversations. But I've always found that just being candid with people, if they ask me a question, I don't know the answer, I'll say, look, I don't know the answer, but give me half an hour, I'll go away, look at it and come back at you. And it's those things I think leave lasting impressions with people. And also inviting them out for a coffee when you're free. That goes a long way of saying, look, do you want to catch up for a coffee? And as I say, a lot of my friends now, particularly because I moved from Manchester to London, a lot of my friends now are solicitors that previously instructed me, and they've been to my house, we go out, and it all stemmed from little small things.
Yeah, so effectively it's communication, isn't it? It's got to be really good, effective communication, even if it's just to acknowledge that you've had a brief come in from them. And obviously, if there's anything that you just want to clarify, ask the question, because at least it then shows them that you're all over it. And you've already started to get ahead. I suppose the reality is that you are your own best advert, aren't you, when you're in pupillage? And I suppose you're having to kind of just let everyone see the best side of you. Do you guys have lessons learnt from your pupillage years? Starting with you, Rumen.
I think, just on the topic of clients and building relationships, I think one more thing that I want to emphasize is that a lot of pupils will be fortunate to be in very busy sets where in your first few, as a pupil, as even as a second six pupil, but also as a baby junior, you're going to have so many work requests, and you're going to be so busy that you will be asking yourself, why do I need to go to these drinks? Why do I need to go at this stage of my career and trying to meet more people, given that I'm already turning away work, or I'd rather spend my evening with my friends? I think it does sometimes feel this way, because obviously you need to, as Kate said, invest in it and treat it as a direct commitment, and be there with your full presence and be engaged. And that does tire you on occasions, but I do think it is very important because of that reason, that it's so much easier to build these relationships, become friends, invite people to your house, go out with them, and then build those long-lasting relationships. Ultimately, it will come down to your work, but being nice to your clients and being more modern, I think, is quite important. On the topic of practical tips that I've learned in my second six, I did a little bit of a laundry list of perhaps somewhat granular tips, but I will run through some of them, I think, because they might be helpful to some might have already encountered this. But depending on the kind of hearing you've got, I think I, as in my second six, did a lot of banking work in the county courts, usually acting for banks, across from consumers, and on PPI hearings or other claims against the banks. I think it is quite daunting the first time you go into a county court and you're in person, regardless of the quantum that is at stake. My first hearing to Kate was against somebody a lot more senior. In fact, somebody who was 18 years more senior in call and who appears in the Supreme Court on these cases and things like that. And I'd been, instructed 2 days prior or something like that. But there are some particular practical tips that could make your life easier. For example, I always try to ask my clerks to send me the full list for that particular judge on the day, because very often you see that hearings are blocklisted and there'll be a very busy list, and so you turn up and you're one of 3 cases listed at the same time. So it gives you a better expectation of what's going to happen that morning and when you might get called. One thing to advertise Bar Council a little bit, actually, do sign on to the Bar Council, because it gives you access to this basically Apple Wallet or otherwise identity card with which you can whiz through security in the county courts by just showing them this pass. And it's incredible. It changes the feeling altogether, because you feel like somebody who's actually, oh yes, I'm part of, I'm part of the justice system, and sort of you don't need to be searched and go through, open all your belongings. But it also saves a lot of time. So definitely do use that. It doesn't work in Central London County Court, because in the Royal Courts of Justice, also doesn't work in the Rolls Building. The only people allowed there with such passes are judges, unfortunately. Make sure you read the hearing notice for that particular hearing. Very often, once you get into it, you will expect that there'll be standard directions set for a final hearing. Every now and then, you might encounter a court with a somewhat quirky order. For example, there is a court that requires skeleton arguments to be up to 2 pages in particular hearings. And if you file skeletons more than 2 pages, your statement of case probably will be struck out altogether, which is draconian, but that is their order. So make sure, and it's very unusual, but it does happen. So make sure you do read that. The obvious thing, trains are unpredictable, but you'll find that be there as early as you can. Some hearings are very early in the morning, you need to travel far. If your train is a little bit late and you might end up getting to court 5 or 10 minutes later, call your clerks. They can call up or email the relevant court. They've got their details, and just let them know that you're going to be late. Reality is, as long as the judge knows that you're going, for the most part, they're going to wait for you. They're going to find a way. They usually have busy lists. They can hear somebody else first, and they will, as long as they know you're going, they will find a way, for the most part, within reason, to wait for you. So do make sure you just communicate that. I think Kate mentioned bankruptcy. I've been in some winding and petition cases in bankruptcy court, which is a spectacle of its own. There'll be sometimes tens, if not hundreds, of barristers there, all robed. 2 tips for that. One is, when you turn up, you're gonna be acting in a particular case. First thing you should look at is the list for that day and see where you are on the list, because there will be something like 300 cases. They will be called one after the other. And one of my tips is also remember the 2 cases before your case, their names, so that when you're sitting in the court, either doing other work or thinking about something else, when you hear those names, you look up and you're ready to start your submissions that are going to be coming up very shortly, because these cases do tend to go by. And I have seen barristers who just forget, who just don't hear their case, but they're there, and then they're like, oh sorry, judge, I was here. So can we go back? So do listen for that. And the second thing is that sometimes you get told by the judge, I'm going to take the second time around, which if you hear it for the first time in court, is going to mean absolutely nothing. What it means is that the judge is going to come back to you again at the end of the list after everybody's done. But the trick to that is that some judges, because the lists are broken down in half hours, there'll be a list of 10:30, 11, 11:30, 12. Some judges call you back after the 10:30 list is done, so you could be called as soon as 10:50, so don't go out for coffee or lunch. And some judges do that at the end of the whole list, so it'll be closer to 1 o'clock. So be careful about that.
Yeah, and sometimes I think, sorry, just jumping in on that, room, and sometimes I think that if you're not in court when you needed to be and a judge is kept waiting, they can sometimes make critical comments, which when you're pupillage year, you can sometimes take quite personally. But one of the people who may be touching on that for us, it is Rachel Chris, who I'm going to invite into our discussion, who's going to deal with equality and diversity as an equality and diversity consultant, but someone who sees and knows more about that, and hopefully will be able to help people with advice and resources. If you want to introduce yourself, Rachel, and what you do, and particularly give any guidance on people witnessing any bullying, whether in chambers or in court.
Yes, thank you, Lucky, and thanks for having me. So I work with the Equality and Diversity team at the Bar Council, and we provide a lot of resources and support for pupils and barristers and people working in and around the bar and in chambers. So I just want to give you a bit of a bit of information about what's available, and you're going to be sent an email afterwards with loads more links, so don't feel you have to write all of this down. So pupillage in particular, it's a very exciting time and everyone's worked very hard to get here, but it's also, you know, as we've already heard, it can be overwhelming. It's not always what we expected. The pressures can be very intense, and sometimes even the content of the work can be very tough to handle. Not everyone's confident at first in, you know, making those connections that we need to make. I hear barristers telling me about imposter syndrome, even very, very experienced barristers and KCs telling me about the imposter syndrome they sometimes fear. The fear of making mistakes can sometimes feel really overwhelming because of the responsibility that barristers hold. So all of that can be a lot to take on. And then in addition, like any institution, there are some bullies in and around the bar. You know, we've heard about very demanding judges. They can be in chambers, they can be opposing counsel. And we do get reports of harassment and discrimination. Not everyone's as kind or as inclusive as we'd really like them to be. We published some research at the end of last year about prevalence of these behaviours and the types of behaviours that barristers experience, including pupils. And we didn't do that to scare anyone. We don't want to put people off. You know, the bar is just not different to any other workplace, I suppose. But we did want people to know, who are working in and around the bar, that especially those who've experienced these sorts of behaviours, that they're not alone. And it does happen. We are really trying hard to do something about this, and we're about to launch quite a big independent inquiry into bullying and harassment at the bar, and hopefully that'll give us some better answers. But if you are a pupil and if you have a problem, or if you witness something happening, whether it's in relation to your own well-being or something that happened to you while you're doing pupillage, there's lots of support. I'd say if you're in chambers or if you're in an employed setting, like look to chambers first. And George has already said, you know, the clerks are there to help you. Your pupil supervisor, they're not just there to make sure that you're getting the work or keeping on top of pupillage, they're also there to support you. There's also, every chambers has an equality and diversity officer, and they're very well placed to support if there's an issue. If you're in an employed setting, there'll be HR support. But it can be anyone else that you trust within chambers. Go and talk to someone. The main thing is, don't suffer alone. There'll be support available. And if you can go into chambers or just get on a WhatsApp group or make a Teams call, get someone to talk to you. If you don't feel you can talk to anyone in chambers or at work, or if you do speak to people and they're not as helpful as you want, there's also a lot of other information available. We've got something called the Wellbeing at the Bar website. You're going to be sent a link to that website. It's got loads of information, both about kind of self-help stuff, how you can help yourself. It shares sort of examples of other people, what they've done, what's worked for them, but also information on how to get more help, including one-to-one support. All pupils can access the assistance programme. There's a link from that to that on the Wellbeing at the Bar website. Plus, there's programs in the inns, on circuits, and the specialist bar associations. They all have a lot of support available and really want to help, especially new barristers and pupil barristers who are, you know, just getting started and on their feet. Now, the other thing we've set up in the last couple of years is something called Talk to Spot, which is a confidential reporting platform that we set up at the Bar Council. Anybody working in and around the bar can use it. You don't have to give your name. You don't have to give us any information more, any more than you want. It's all online, and if you decide you want to, you can submit your report, and that comes to either me or my colleague Sam Mercer in the equality team at the Bar Council. We receive quite a few, I mean, about 5 to 10 reports a week, ranging around all sorts of behaviours. So there's nothing too small, nothing too incident, nothing too unimportant, or nothing too serious. We're happy to deal with what have you. We will respond on the platform, so you never have to tell us who you are. We'll often help you get more support, tell you what the best thing to do is, based on what we've seen before works for other people. We can help you take it further if actually you want to make a more formal report to something like the BSB, but we'll never force you to do anything. It'll be entirely up to you, but we're always here and we're always very happy to help and support. We've also got an email address, which is equality@barcouncil.org.uk. You can just email us, and it's always confidential, and we'll always signpost you to where we think you can get more help. So hopefully it's reassuring. We are here to help, and we do want you to do well, and also to be well and happy while doing well at the bar.
Just on the Talk to Spot,
Yeah.
Rachel, is that an anonymous facility? So you don't have to leave your real name or anything like that?
Yeah, you can put as much or as little information as you want. So you don't have to put your name. It can be completely confidential. You don't have to put an email. You have to put an email address into the system so it can email you the details, but no one at our side will ever see that unless you want us to see your email address. So it's as little information as you want, and we can respond to you via the platform. So quite often I'll have kind of ongoing conversations with people on the platform. I won't know who they are, but that doesn't matter because it's about giving the information and help. And quite often people just want to say something happened, it made them feel not great, and they just want someone else to share that, and they don't want to go any further with that, and that's absolutely fine. That's partly what we're here for. But we've also taken reports on Talk to Spot where actually we've seen a pattern of behaviour. They're not the only person who's reported it. Actually, quite a few people have complained about the same judge, for example, or the same barrister. And we're able to then sort of jigsaw together those complaints and actually take them further in a way that we wouldn't have been able to if people hadn't put these reports in. So it's really useful.
And so that sort of report, if I can put it that way, where the same judge comes up time and time again, where is that fed through to? Does it go to circuit leaders, presiders on circuit, who in turn may or may not have a meeting with said judge?
So it really depends on what the complainant wants. So we'll never do anything unless the complainant says, yes, you can do something about it. Sometimes we've supported complainants to actually use there's a complaints procedure that you can make complaints about judges. The JCIO run it, and we've helped people do that, but that's not always what everyone wants. Quite often what we've done, especially if it's multiple reports about the same judges, we're able to go to the judiciary. We've got good contacts, with our sort of counterparts in the judiciary, and say, look, we've had a few reports about this courtroom. Some of them are a bit worrying. Could you go in and have a look at what's happening? Could you have an informal chat with the judge? Because we've had a number of reports, say from quite junior barristers, and the way they're behaving hasn't made them feel comfortable. And those informal responses we find can be very much more effective. They can quickly nip in the bud some behaviours, and it can be more effective than expecting very junior people to bring very formal reports or go through a very formal process. We've done the same with barristers in chambers. So, for example, I had a report a couple of weeks ago. Someone had had a really horrible experience in a robing room in a county court. They gave me the name of the barrister. I was able to have a conversation with the barrister and just say, look, this behaviour, we've been told about this behaviour. They're not going to make a formal report, but they're really upset about it. And the barrister was, actually responded extremely well to that informal, look, this has happened. They don't want to take it any further, but we think you owe them an apology. And they did a full apology, and it made them stop to think. So I think those sorts of responses, sometimes we can be in a good position to do that, especially for more junior members of the bar who don't want to do it themselves or can't.
Yeah, and those resources are there not because they are needed all day, every day by everyone at the bar, but just so that people
Exactly.
know that there is something there
Exactly.
if they need to turn. So thank you very much for that, Rachel. And I think you said that there will be various links that will be sent out afterwards to signpost.
Absolutely.
So hopefully that practical advice has been useful for everyone. But if we can now introduce Jonathan Lawrence, who's a partner at Place Campbell, into our discussions. This is really quite an important aspect for everyone, really. Managing finances when you become self-employed, record keeping, filling in tax returns, which actually can have significant sanctions if not done properly. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lucky. So I'm just going to share some slides because there's quite a bit of material to go through. And hopefully, is that all looking good to everyone?
Yeah.
So my name is Jonathan Lawrence. I'm a partner at Place Campbell, and Place Campbell specialise in dealing with barristers and barristers' chambers. So we have a lot of experience and expertise in this area. And really, what I'm going to do is just run through a few of the key sort of conceptual things that you need to be aware of as a barrister. And I think the most important thing for pupil barristers is to recognise that you are a self-employed individual. And that's important because as a self-employed individual, the onus on tax compliance is on you. So unlike when you're employed, where your employer will deal with the tax compliance for you, you have to deal with your own tax compliance. And no one, maybe your clerks if you're lucky, but no one is going to come along and intervene to make sure that you meet this compliance requirement. So you have to take it upon yourself to identify what you need to be doing and when you need to be doing it. And it's an interesting fact how many people actually don't do this. When I was looking at putting these slides together, I came across a statistic that in the 22 and 23 tax year, 95% of the penalties that were issued were for failure to notify. And that's where basically someone was unaware that they needed to make a declaration for income tax or possibly VAT, and it resulted in a penalty for that. So you really do need to take on board at this stage that as a pupil, you become self-employed and you need to deal with your tax compliance requirements. You need to be identifying what taxes apply to you and when you need to make declarations and when you need to make payments to avoid getting into trouble. So the two taxes that we're going to talk about are income tax and VAT. Obviously, there are a lot more taxes than income tax and VAT, but these are the ones that apply most directly to barristers as a result of their practice. And I'm just going to run through each of them because they are actually quite different in the way that they are applied, and the deadlines and the compliance requirements are very different. So income tax, I've put up there income tax and class 4 national insurance. I'm not going to talk about national insurance specifically because these days national insurance, class 4 national insurance, is calculated on the same basis as income tax, although it's a different percentage, but it's calculated on the same income. There is a separate form of national insurance, class 2 national insurance, which is very important when it comes to pension contributions. But again, that's dealt with through the self-assessment tax return as well. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But the first thing to really identify in terms of income tax is what you pay tax on. And it's not actually your income, which is good, it's your profits. So you need to be able to identify your income, that is chargeable to tax and the expenses that can be deducted in calculating profit on which your tax will be calculated, and you'll have to pay your tax to HM Revenue and Customs. One of the key things that is actually changing, but as a pupil barrister, when we talk about income and expenses, we're actually talking about cash basis expenses. So it's what you've received and what you've paid in expenses. The difference between the two is your profit. And also, when we talk about income and expenses for income tax, that's after VAT. So when you receive a payment for a piece of work that you've done and you're VAT registered, the payment you will receive will include VAT, but you don't calculate your tax on your VAT inclusive income. It's net of VAT, and that's quite important, and particularly when I go on to talk about VAT in a minute, that becomes clearer, but it's your after VAT income. Expenses, so we calculate the tax liability on your profit. So what expenses can be deducted from your income in calculating the profit figure? And the list is very long, and for barristers there are specific expenses that occur again and again and again, but the key concept is the wholly and exclusively for the purposes of trade or vocation, and that is that if you've incurred an expense to do your job, then it's a deductible expense in calculating your profit. So Chambers contributions will be incurred because you're a barrister. Your travel to court will be incurred because you're a barrister. The rent on your home, potentially some of it can be included, but not necessarily all of it. So generally the key thing is to identify the expenses that you've incurred because of what you do, and they will generally be deductible. And our advice always when we're dealing with our clients is if you think that you've incurred it because of your profession, let us know about it, and then we can tell you why it can't be included, because we'd far rather you identify an expense that you think can be included rather than not mention it and not have that deduction in computing your profits for tax. So once you've worked out what your profit is, then you need to report that. And we report your profits for a set period of time. So your profits will be for a year. And going forward, that will always be for the tax year. And the tax year runs from the 6th of April to the 5th of April in the following year. I've made a small mention in there that by concession, we can treat the 5th of April, which is the tax year, as a 31st of March year end. So we can ignore those 5 days. And that means that we can draw all the figures up to a nice month end, which makes life tidier. But it will always be for that year. And the profits for that year will form the income on which your tax is calculated for that year. So the 5th of April 2024 will be for the tax year, 5th of April, for the tax year 23-24. And you need to report that profit on a tax return, a self-assessment tax return. So again, this comes back to the idea that it's your responsibility to make that declaration, self-assessment. You need to tell HM Revenue and Customs what your profits are for the year and what your tax liability is on those profits. And for the tax year ended 5th of April 24, for example, that needs to be reported to HM Revenue and Customs by the 31st of January the following year. So for 24, that'd be 31st of January 25. And that will become, as you develop through your practice, that will become a key date in your mind, 31st of January each year, because you have to have your self-assessment tax return in. So the amount of tax that you have to pay on your profits varies, because at different income levels, different tax rates apply. So you can have a personal allowance on which you pay no tax, the first 12,500 of your income, and then you pay some of tax at some of your income at 40%, at 20%, and then at 40%, and then you've got your national insurance on top. So it's really quite complicated. And a while ago, I did this sort of little, because I'm an accountant, this little schedule which says you, as your income goes up, so we've got someone's income at the bottom, or the profits at the bottom, and that's the amount of tax as a percentage that you might pay on that income. So you can see that to start with, at lower levels of income, the percentage that you pay tax at really changes quite significantly until you get to very high levels of income, and it just plateaus off. But as a general rule, I would say for a pupil, you need to be thinking about putting to one side of every receipt you get, between 30 and 40% of that receipt. Now, that's not accounting for your expenses, that's just of your receipts. But once you deduct your Chamber's contributions, other expenses, that's the sort of amount that you need to be thinking about putting to one side, so that when your tax bill becomes due, you've got enough money to pay it. And the average rate of tax can, well, it's a lot higher, and marginal rate of tax is much higher, but after expenses, that's what you need to be thinking about. I've put the higher end in there because it's always better to have more than you need to pay your tax than less than you need to pay your tax. But that's what you need to sort of be thinking about when you receive a check in, after you've deducted the VAT, 30 to 40%. So when do you have to pay the tax? Well, you pay the tax 2 times, income tax 2 times during the tax year, during the calendar year. So 31st of January, when your tax return's due in, you make a payment, and then the 31st of July, you make a payment. The 31st of January payment is comprised of 2 elements. It's a balancing payment and a first payment on account. So 31st of January 25, you'll be making a balancing payment in relation to your tax liability for the accounting year to the 5th of April 24. So whatever your profits were for the year to April 24, calculate the liability, balancing payment due at the end of the following January. The balancing payment element is the difference between what you've paid on account and your actual liability for the year. So in addition to the balancing payment at the end of January, you also have to make a first payment on account against the next year. So in January 2025, an element of that payment would be a payment on account against your accounting year ending 5th of April 25. And then in the July, you make a second payment on account against the accounting year ending 5th of April 25. So when you go into the following January, you've made 2 payments on account against that year. And if that wasn't enough to meet the liability for that year, you have to make a balancing payment January 26. But when you first start in practice, you won't have made any payments on account. And this is a really important issue, because that 1st January, so if your first set of accounts went to 5th of April 24, January 25, you would have no payments on account. So your balancing payment would be the full liability for the year, plus a first payment on account against the next year. And the payments on account are half of the previous year's liability. So you're going to be faced with a payment that's 150% of your liability for your first year. So that's why it's really important to save as you go to meet that liability. And then once you're in the payments on account system, it's not quite so bad, but you do need to be thinking about that ahead of time. So when you become self-employed, well, generally speaking, it's the date that you start your second six. So from that point, the old phrase is when you become willing and able, but when you can hold yourself out to earn fees in your own right, that's the date that you become self-employed from. And you must submit a tax return for the tax year in which you become self-employed. So even if you became self-employed, so your second stick starts on the 1st of April 24, you need to complete a 2024 tax return. Although it's only 5 days, you still need to complete a tax return for that year. You need to tell HM Revenue and Customs by the beginning of October that you're self-employed. And then you'll be then into the self-assessment system. You'll be issued with a UTR number, unique tax reference, if you haven't already got one. And then you'll in the January, you'll need to then submit January 25, and then need to submit your first tax return. So the key dates are end of January, following the tax year in which you start self-employment, and the October following the tax year that you start self-employment. So you need to inform them by that date and submit your first tax return. So those are the key things in relation to the timing for income tax. So let's just move on to VAT. I think that although most barristers won't agree with me on this point, but the key thing to think about conceptually with regard to VAT is that as a VAT registered business, you don't actually suffer VAT. You're actually just collecting VAT over. So if you have a fee that you charge your client, that fee is £100, you add VAT onto it, 20%. So you're going to get £120 in from that client, your fee of £100 plus the £20 VAT. That £20 was never yours. You are just collecting it in for HM Revenue and Customs, and then you pay that over to HM Revenue and Customs. It was never yours. And I think if you keep that in mind, then you're going to be fairly safe with regards to VAT, because that money just needs to go to one side and be left there until it needs to be paid over to HM Revenue and Customs. So as a VAT registered business, you will collect in VAT on your sales, and you will also incur VAT on your expenses. And your the amount that you pay over is the difference between what you've collected in on your sales and the VAT that you've incurred on your expenses and had to pay over on your expenses. You deduct one from the other, and that is the amount that you pay over. And you account for it and pay for it quarterly. So VAT returns are for a quarter. So once you become registered, HM Revenue and Customs will write to you and say you are registered from this date, and you now need to complete a VAT return. Usually the first return is for a month or maybe 2 months, and then it will be quarterly thereafter. Whatever your quarter date ends on, you have a month, just over a month, to submit your VAT return and also pay over the VAT. And that's why it's really important that you don't assume that that £20 that you've been paid on top of your fee is yours, because it's going to be paid over to the revenue very shortly thereafter. So if you spent it, you're going to be in trouble. So I think George touched upon this, that you have to register when your turnover exceeds 85,000. That's just gone up in the last budget. It's gone up to 90,000, and that's calculated on a 12-month rolling basis. So it's not 80,000 for the last year. It's each month you add on this month's income to the last 12 months and deduct the first month of those 12 months from that income. So you look at it on a rolling basis. And if at the end of that month you've gone over, you need to register for VAT. However, normally, and I think George touched upon this again, normally, and I think it's more often when you are given tenancy, the clerks will say, okay, so now you're a tenant, please can you register? And that's called voluntary registration, VAT registration. And as I say, because all you're actually doing is collecting tax, it makes no difference to you whether you're VAT registered or not. And some people suggest that it might actually, in terms of status, be a good thing, because if you're not VAT registered, your turnover has to be below 85,000. So in terms of perception of clients, then they're going to know that you're beginning of your practice, income's lower, so maybe it looks better if you are VAT registered. I don't know. VAT compliance is dealt with through a system called Making Tax Digital, and this is actually going to be rolled out for income tax too. But what it means is that in order to submit your VAT return, you need to keep records in accounting software. You don't just fill in a form, as is the case with income tax at the moment, and send that form off to the revenue. You need a piece of accounting software that you keep your accounting records in as you go. So records of your income and records of your expenses. And then from that accounting software, you make a direct submission to HM Revenue and Customs. So it's important as soon as you are engaged with VAT, that registered, that you acquire that software and you start keeping your records. And from the income side, that's very easy because you will have payment summaries, which will record all of your income, and that's dealt with by your clerks. And you will need to then input the expenses in order to work out how much is due each quarter to HM Revenue and Customs. So that's a general summary of VAT. I would say, obviously, and this isn't the same as fish, but I would say that you're going to have a lot to think about during the course of your career. You're going to be very busy in managing your career, and it is highly advisable that you get an accountant. Now, I'm not saying you should rock up to place accountant, but just get an accountant, and they can help you organize your affairs. They can send you reminders when things need doing. They can help you with VAT compliance. And I would strongly advocate that you speak to an accountant when you start your second six, so from when you become self-employed, so that you can get things set up. They can have a detailed discussion with you about the sorts of things you can and can't be claiming, so that you get off on the right foot rather than leaving it until really late in the day, and it's just going to add to the stresses and worries that you have on top of your regular practice. So start out how you mean to go on, preferably engage someone that can help you do it. So it's just one less thing for you to have to think about, and you should be fine as long as you make sure that you keep on tucking that 30-40% away as you go. It shouldn't be too much of a headache for you, and that's it really. I think we're going to move into some questions.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Jonathan. And I'm sure, well, I hope that it's been really quite informative for those who have joined the session. I'm going to ask if all of the panelists can join us for the Q&A. I'm conscious of time and I don't want to keep everyone too long. We've had quite a few questions come in, and if I can, what I might do is see if I can ask each of you a question each, which deals with respective areas and topics. I'm going to start, if I can, with a question for George, please. How do you speak to clerks about boundaries to your practice? The example given is childcare. So how would you suggest that a pupil or someone in practice best approaches that with the clerks?
Upfront and direct. We're very much used to flexible working, parental care, even within the classroom, especially after COVID. People work from home so they can pick up and take their kids to school. So it's perfectly normal request. Many people coming back after maternity or paternity it does range. Some people take one particular day off each week with a little bit of flexibility. Obviously, the way that your self-employed practices work, if you do pick a individual day, it can be a bit trickier, but it is possible. It does mean sometimes you may need to say no to last-minute urgent inquiries, but you wouldn't be ruled out. We as clerks would like the work covered, so you'd still get asked, I would imagine, unless you've said that you don't wish to be asked. But we're quite used to people saying that they require 2 days at home a week, but it's flexible. So at the start or the end of each week, however you want to do it, we'll sit down and see which days you can do, or it's very much, I suppose, dictated by the work that they're doing at that particular time. They'll tell us. But yeah, just be upfront and direct.
Yeah, perfect. Sorry, I'm going to try and whiz through as many of these as I can. Rumen, question for you, if I can, please. What's the best approach to take if a judge asks you a legal question and you don't know the answer? What's the advice that you would give in that scenario?
Definitely to not make up an answer. Don't say something you're not comfortable with. Depending on the hearing, either say to the judge, For example, if there's a lunch break that you come back after lunch. If there isn't, but it's an important question, say that you prepare a note after the hearing and send it via to the clerk. Or again, depending on how important it is for the judge. If they want to give an extempore judgment later that day, maybe ask for an adjournment, and then maybe they can see you in an hour or two when you've got the answer. It doesn't happen very often in your early days of practice, to be honest, because I think one of the pieces of advice that I might have is textbooks are your friend. Ask your supervisors what textbooks they usually go to, and do the same. And I think most of the hearings you'll be doing on your own, on your feet, will be ones where the law is very settled, and usually the judges will know it. But it does happen. It does happen very much in the High Court. It happens to silks all the time, and usually when you're led by a silk who doesn't know the answer, you're going to be the person researching the answer. And while the silk says, "We'll get back to you," you're already on your laptop in the hearing, looking for the answer and being ready to give it. It's happened to me. I think it's happened to all of us, and that's the way to go around it.
I'd agree with that. Definitely don't make up the answer. You'll find yourself getting into a bit of a hole if you try. Question for Kate, if I can, please, particularly because you touched on this in the discussions. Do you have any advice for managing nerves before the first solo court appearance?
I think the biggest thing to do is speak to other people who are a similar level of call to you, because they're going to be the people that are doing that sort of work, and they can give you the best advice and what to do and what not to do. You are going to have nerves. I just don't think you're going to get rid of them. Your first, couple of times going into court doing different things. I was, in the Court of Appeal by myself last year, and I was so nervous about it. It does happen, but asking people, what do I need to take? Where do I sit? Do I stand up? What do I address the judge? Those sorts of things, and make a note on your laptop where it's really easy accessible, really helps calm that down. But you will get over it the more you do. So just, everyone's been there, everyone's done it. It just comes with time.
I'd agree with that as well. And trying to remember everything from your first six, because whilst you're in your first six, I suppose you just think that you're observing, but actually you really do need to soak it all in order to then remember when you get onto your feet yourself exactly what you've seen. Just a question for Rachel. Handling unpleasant junior tenants and bullying within chambers. I think you've already touched on this, but there are a number of discrete ways of doing it, aren't there?
There are, and it's not always possible to speak up for yourself in those scenarios. Although, if you do feel you can, tell them that you think their behaviour is not on is one option. But there are people within chambers who can help. Every single chambers has a bullying and harassment policy and have informal and formal ways of dealing with inappropriate behaviour. So go and speak to the EDO or your pupil supervisor or a chum in chambers. Talk to them. Find out who to speak to, but also get some support for yourself from those people, and then try and bring it up, and don't be afraid to say if something's bothering you. And usually chambers will take a sort of proportionate and informal approach if that's the right thing to do. We really hope that it wouldn't have an impact on your relationships within chambers, but you can't put up with this stuff. It can really impact on your ability to come into chambers and enjoy your work. So dealing with it rather than ignoring it or feeling it's just something you've done wrong is the best advice I can give.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And final question, this one's for you, Jonathan, and I'm sorry I'm going to ask it very quickly because I'm conscious of time and we need to wrap up. But similar questions that have come up, one of which is for people who aren't, I suppose, on top of finances and maths and so on. Accountants will do all of that work for individuals if they have accountants instructed, right? You're on mute, Jonathan.
Absolutely. So the goal is to make it as easy as it can possibly be for the barrister so that they can concentrate on their work, and that would be the ideal. So yeah, you don't need to be good at maths or even engage with it that much. You just need to provide certain information when you're asked for it. But the rest of it, we submit the tax returns, we submit the VAT returns, we keep the accounting records. Chambers, the clerking system, that records all of the income. So it can be very, very straightforward. It's just sort of the odds and sods expenses that we need that we can't get from Chambers, but the rest of it we can do ourselves, and that's really what we're here to do, to make it easy for the barrister.
Yeah, and would you advise that actually people should have accountants rather than trying to submit returns themselves?
It's a tricky question for me to answer.
Yeah,
absolutely. Sure. I absolutely would. Yeah, not all joking aside, sales pitch aside, I really would. The amount of time that it could take you in terms of, not you, but a barrister, in terms of billable hours to work your way through a self-assessment tax return on the Revenue's website, keep your VAT records up to date, it's just not cost effective. So I would strongly suggest that that's the way forward. Develop a good relationship with your accountant. And some of I've been with Place Campbell for 22 years, and I still act for people that I saw in my first week here. It's a long-term relationship. And if you have that good relationship with them, it should be really a very sort of straightforward compliance requirement. So yeah, no filling in VAT returns or filling in the tax returns. Someone else does that for you. You just provide them with the information to do it. And then even then, it's only some of the information, because a lot of it can be obtained from other sources, mainly Chambers.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we actually have more questions than I think we have time to answer. Unfortunately, we've had quite a few posted during the course of the webinar, some already sent through. I am going to wrap up the session there. I'm conscious of the time, but can I please thank the panelists for giving up their time this evening. Jonathan, thank you very much for your very, very helpful slides. There have been a number of questions following on from those. I think, and understandably, I think pupils are quite concerned about making sure that they are on top of their tax obligations. Equally, Rachel, thank you very much for the information that you've provided, which actually, in fact, was useful for me as well. And so I'm hoping that the pupil barristers and others who have joined have also found it beneficial. George, Kate and Ruman, thank you very much as well for your very helpful discussion points today. Just to let everyone know as well that there will be signposts to various resources that have already been mentioned this evening. They'll be sent out to you. If we're able to answer any questions in writing, we will try and do so. But as I say, there have been a lot of them, and unfortunately, we just won't be able to get through all of them. There is some material that will come out to you in relation to the Young Barristers Committee as well. For those of you who are interested in doing some work with the Young Barristers Committee, they are not just based in London. And so for anyone who's outside of the South Eastern Circuit, do get involved with your local circuits as well. They do provide a very useful point of contact. You get to know a lot of people locally, people outside of your chambers, and are a really good useful membership to have, particularly when you're outside of London, because they can provide education and training too. And of course, if you do have any concerns, you can always raise them on circuit, and then they can be then fed down to London if needs be, to the council and the BSB where necessary. But I hope that you've all found the session useful. And as I say, if we can answer any more questions by email or in writing, we will certainly try. But I think that's all from all of us this evening. And once again, thank you to all of the panelists and the guests who have joined tonight.